A police officer smashed Malia Obama's cell phone. He regretted it a minute later when her father, Barack Obama, arrived. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun bathed the park in a golden glow, filtering through the branches of towering oaks and maple trees. A light breeze rustled the leaves, sending a few spiraling down onto the well-maintained pathways. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Families strolled along the paved walkways, mothers pushing strollers while chatting on their phones, elderly couples walking hand in hand, their conversations soft and measured. Laughter echoed from a group of teenagers gathered near the fountain, taking selfies and recording short videos for social media. It was the kind of morning that exuded serenity, where the biggest worry on anyone's mind was whether to grab a latte or a cappuccino from the nearby cafe. Sitting on a wooden bench near a small pond, a young girl scrolled through her phone, her fingers effortlessly gliding across the screen. She was dressed casually but neatly. Jeans, a light hoodie, and a pair of white sneakers. A backpack rested beside her, unzipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of a book inside. Her name was Malia. She was completely immersed in her phone, her expression neutral but focused. Text messages popped up on the screen from her friends, asking about their plans for the weekend. Occasionally, she glanced up, taking in the scenery, but her attention always returned to her device. She wasn't waiting for anyone in particular, just passing the time. She knew her father would come to pick her up soon, but there was no rush. Despite her relaxed posture, there was a certain air of composure about her. She wasn't slouching or looking lost. She was just another person in the park, minding her own business. Then she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, she ignored it. It wasn't uncommon for people to glance at her. She was used to it, growing up in a family where privacy was more of an illusion than a reality. But this felt different. She lifted her eyes slightly, not turning her head, just enough to scan the area in front of her. And that's when she saw it. A police cruiser had pulled up near the curb, its engine still running, the sunlight bouncing off the polished hood. The driver's side window was rolled halfway down, and inside sat a man with a rigid posture, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't look away when their eyes met. Malia blinked, unsure if she should react. Maybe he was just surveying the park, doing his job. Maybe she was overthinking it. But then the engine cut off, the door swung open, and out stepped the officer. The way he moved was deliberate, controlled, like someone who had already decided how this interaction would go. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed buzz cut and an expression that was permanently set into a scowl. His uniform was pristine, the badge on his chest gleaming under the morning sun. He wasn't looking at anyone else. He was coming straight for her. Malia's grip tightened around her phone. As he closed the distance, she forced herself to stay calm. She had done nothing wrong. This was a public park. She had every right to be here. Still, the way he moved, the way his eyes bore into her sent a cold shiver down her spine. A few people in the park took notice of the approaching officer, but no one intervened. Why would they? He was the authority, and she was just another teenager on a bench. The officer stopped a few feet away from her. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her. Then he spoke. "What are you doing here?" His voice was rough, clipped, like he was already irritated by her presence. Malia looked up, trying to gauge his expression. She kept her voice steady. "Just sitting." The officer's eyes flicked to her phone, then back to her face. "You live around here?" There was something accusatory in his tone, like the answer was already decided in his head. Malia frowned slightly. The question itself wasn't unusual, but the way he asked it wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion. She didn't like that. "Yes," she replied simply. The officer's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. "You got ID?" Malia hesitated, not because she didn't have it. Her student ID was in her backpack, but because this was starting to feel less like a routine question and more like an interrogation. She shifted slightly on the bench, forcing herself to stay calm. "Why?" she asked. The officer's jaw tightened. "Because I asked." The tension between them thickened. Malia glanced around, wondering if anyone was really paying attention. A couple, sitting on a nearby bench, glanced in their direction but quickly looked away. An older man walking his dog slowed his pace, watching from a distance. She could feel her heart picking up speed. This wasn't just some casual inquiry. The officer wasn't here to help. He was here because he had already decided something about her. She could see it in his eyes. Her fingers hovered over the screen of her phone. Maybe she should call her dad, but before she could, the officer's next words made her stomach drop. "Let me see that phone." Malia looked up sharply. She had expected more questions, maybe even some half-hearted excuse about a disturbance in the area. But this was different. He wasn't just suspicious of her presence, he was trying to take something from her. Malia hesitated, gripping the device a little tighter. There was no reason for him to ask for it, none. "I don't understand," she said carefully. "Why do you need now?" His voice was sharp, commanding. It wasn't a request, it was an order. And in that moment, Malia realized something. This was never going to be a conversation. This was always going to be about control. Her stomach twisted. Her pulse pounded in her ears. And then, the officer moved. The shift in atmosphere was palpable. Malia sat frozen for a split second, her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of the officer's demand pressed against her like an invisible force, making it harder to breathe. She gripped her phone tighter. She knew, deep down, that nothing about this was right. But that didn't change the reality of the situation. The officer's presence loomed over her, his posture rigid with authority. His eyes were cold, assessing, waiting for her to comply. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then he took another step forward. "I said, now." His voice was sharper this time, edged with impatience, his hand already moving toward the device in her grasp. Malia instinctively leaned away, her body tensing. Her mind raced. If she handed over her phone, what would he do with it? Scroll through her messages? Look through her photos? Who would stop him? A few people were watching now, but none of them moved. She swallowed hard. She didn't want to escalate this. She knew how these things played out, but she also knew she hadn't done anything wrong. And she wasn't just going to hand over her phone because some cop, who had no reason to demand it, wanted to intimidate her. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Why?" The officer's expression darkened. A slow exhale through his nose. Then he leaned in, his shadow stretching over her like a storm cloud. "You asking me questions now?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You think this is optional?" Malia's grip on her phone tightened. Her fingers curled around the edges, her knuckles white. She wasn't being disrespectful. She wasn't raising her voice. But that didn't matter, did it? She could see it in his posture, in the way his jaw tightened. He had already made up his mind about her. It didn't matter what she said. It didn't matter how polite she was. She wasn't a person to him. She was a problem, and problems needed to be handled. The officer's patience snapped. "Give me the damn phone." And before she could react, before she could process what was happening, his hand shot out. A sharp tug, her fingers slipped, and then it was gone. The phone was in his grasp. The world seemed to slow. A stunned, hollow silence settled over the moment as Malia sat there, her hands empty, her breath catching in her throat. For a second, all she could do was stare. He really took it. He just took it. The anger came fast and hot. It surged through her veins, making her limbs feel shaky, her vision sharp. Her mouth opened, words forming at the edge of her tongue, when she heard it. A laugh, low, derisive. She looked up. The officer was holding her phone in one hand, turning it over, inspecting it like it was some kind of stolen artifact. He shook his head. "What kind of kid needs a phone like this?" he mused almost to himself. Then his eyes flicked back to her. His smirk curled. "Bet you stole it." The words hit her like a slap. Malia felt something inside her tighten, coil, like a spring being wound too far. "No," she said, her voice firmer now. "It's mine. My dad got it for me." The officer's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. "Yeah?" he said, tilting his head. "That's so?" And then, with a flick of his wrist, he let go. The phone crashed onto the pavement. The impact sent a sharp, sickening crack into the air. Malia flinched. The screen shattered instantly, tiny fractures spiderwebbing across the glass. For a moment, everything was still. The world seemed to hold its breath. Malia stared. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't just a phone. It was her connection to the world. Her messages, her photos, her music, her conversations, everything. Gone. Destroyed. Like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. The officer took a step back, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged. "There," he said. "Problem solved." Malia slowly lifted her gaze to him. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from fear, no, not anymore, but from the sheer burning injustice of it all. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. People had stopped walking. A small crowd had formed, a collection of stunned, silent faces. They had seen, they had heard, but no one spoke, no one moved, no one helped. The officer glanced at the onlookers, and just like that, the smirk was back. A knowing smirk, a confident smirk, because he knew they wouldn't do anything. They never did. Malia's breath was uneven, her vision blurry, not from tears but from the sheer force of her emotions, from the way her pulse was hammering in her ears. This wasn't fair. It wasn't right. Her fingers clenched into fists. The officer started to turn away, like it was over. Like this was just another routine stop. Like she was supposed to just sit there, accept it, and move on. And maybe that's what he expected. Maybe that's what everyone expected. But then Malia moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her backpack. Her fingers brushed against an old, familiar device. A phone. Not her good one. Not the one that had just been destroyed. A backup. An older model. Scratched. The screen cracked from a drop months ago. It still worked. Her fingers tightened around it, and without hesitation, she dialed. The call barely rang before the voice on the other end picked up. She inhaled sharply. Then she spoke. "Dad?" Her voice was quiet but steady. "I need you to come." The officer laughed, like this was funny, like it was some kind of joke. "Yeah," he scoffed, folding his arms. "And what's Daddy going to do about it?" Malia didn't answer. She didn't have to, because at that moment, in the distance, the sound of engines rumbled, loud, powerful, coming closer. The air shifted. The people watching started whispering. Heads turned. Then from the street. A convoy of black SUVs rolled into view. Malia sat rigid on the bench, her fingers gripping the old phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The broken remains of her other phone lay at her feet, the shattered screen glinting under the morning sun. She could still hear the sharp crack of impact echoing in her mind, the moment of destruction playing on a loop. The officer was still standing there, watching her with that same smug expression, his arms folded across his chest, completely at ease. He thought it was over. He thought she would just sit there, humiliated and powerless, and accept it. But she wouldn't. Not this time. The call had barely rung once before the deep, familiar voice answered. "Malia?" Her father's voice was calm but immediately alert, sensing something was wrong before she even had to say it. She swallowed, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "Dad," she said, her tone controlled but tight with emotion, "I need you to come." That was all she needed to say. There was a pause, brief but loaded with unspoken understanding. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice clipped, direct. She gave him the location, and before she could even say another word, he responded, "I'm on my way." The line went dead. She lowered the phone slowly, the weight of her father's words settling over her like a protective shield. The officer chuckled, shaking his head like this was all some amusing spectacle. "You really think calling Daddy is going to change anything?" he sneered. Malia didn't answer. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. A few people in the crowd were still watching, some recording on their phones now. The energy in the park had shifted. The silent bystanders, once content to remain uninvolved, were starting to realize that something bigger was about to happen. And then, in the distance, the sound of powerful engines cut through the quiet hum of the city. Low, deep, getting closer. The officer's smirk faltered for the first time. Heads turned as a convoy of sleek black SUVs appeared at the end of the street, moving with unmistakable purpose. Their tinted windows reflected the bright morning sun, the polished bodies of the vehicles gleaming as they approached. The lead SUV pulled up to the curb, followed by two more, forming a precise, almost military-like formation. Then, as if the entire world had paused, the doors opened. The first to step out were the men in black suits. Tall, broad, composed, Secret Service agents. Their movements were fluid, efficient, eyes scanning, assessing. The tension in the air thickened as they spread out, forming a protective perimeter around the vehicle that remained still for just a moment longer. And then, from the back seat of the middle SUV, a figure emerged. Barack Obama stepped out with a quiet kind of authority that commanded instant attention. He was dressed simply, in a dark suit with an open-collared shirt, but there was nothing casual about his presence. His eyes were sharp, scanning the scene, taking in everything, the broken phone on the ground, the officer standing over his daughter, the small crowd watching in silence. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. The simple act of him stepping onto the pavement was enough to make the entire moment shift, as if gravity itself had adjusted to his presence. The officer had gone rigid, his smirk gone, replaced by something else entirely. Uncertainty, recognition, and just beneath the surface, the beginning of fear. Obama didn't acknowledge him, not yet. Instead, he walked forward with a deliberate, measured pace, his eyes locked on one thing only, his daughter. Malia exhaled, her composure breaking just slightly as she stood up. She didn't rush to him. She didn't cry. She just met him halfway, and the moment she was close enough, he placed a steady, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now, for her ears only. She nodded, swallowing back the emotions threatening to rise. He studied her for a second longer, searching her face, making sure. Then, and only then, did he turn his gaze toward the officer. The shift was immediate. The calm, fatherly concern disappeared, replaced by something colder, sharper. A silence fell over the park, stretching unbearably as the former President of the United States looked at the man who had dared to lay a hand on his daughter's belongings. The officer stiffened, trying to salvage his confidence, but the ease in his posture was gone. He opened his mouth, no doubt to justify himself, but before he could get a single word out, one of the Secret Service agents took a single step forward. "Officer," the agent said smoothly, his voice polite but firm. "Would you mind identifying yourself?" Blake hesitated. There was no good way out of this now, and he knew it. Still, he squared his shoulders, clearing his throat. "Officer Blake," he said, forcing an edge of authority back into his tone. "And I don't see what this has to do with—" "You don't?" Obama interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. Blake faltered. Obama glanced down, his eyes moving to the shattered phone at his feet. He studied it for a second, as if committing every detail to memory before looking back up. "My daughter was sitting here minding her business," Obama said, his voice measured, "and you decided to take her phone and destroy it." Blake opened his mouth, but Obama cut him off again, stepping closer now. "I want to hear it from you," he said. "Why did you do that?" Blake's jaw tensed. His mind was scrambling, trying to find an answer that wouldn't make him look like the reckless, power-abusing officer he clearly was. He hesitated, then forced out, "She refused to comply." Obama didn't blink. "Comply with what?" Blake struggled for an answer. The crowd was listening now, watching closely. Phones were up, recording every second. Obama took another step forward, his presence overpowering. "Comply with what?" he repeated, voice still low, but there was something in his tone now, a dangerous undercurrent, a quiet warning. Blake swallowed. His confidence was cracking. "She was acting suspicious," he said weakly. "Suspicious." Obama let the word hang between them, like he was tasting it, weighing it. Then, finally, he shook his head. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, but cutting just as deep, "I've seen this before." Blake stiffened. Obama's gaze didn't waver. "I've seen men like you use that word to justify things that have no justification," he continued. "I've seen that word destroy lives." A pause, then he stepped back, turning his head slightly. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, addressing a figure standing near the arriving second patrol car. A higher-ranking officer stepped forward, his face tight with understanding. Obama nodded toward him. "Do your job." Rodriguez didn't hesitate. "Officer Blake," he said, his voice ringing out with finality. "Hand over your badge and weapon, effective immediately." The park erupted into murmurs. Some gasped, others exchanged glances. Blake's face went pale. He hesitated, but Rodriguez's stare left no room for argument. Reluctantly, his hands shaking, he unfastened his badge and placed it in the captain's waiting hand. Then, with visible defeat, he unholstered his weapon and did the same. The weight of the moment settled over him. He had lost. Obama turned back to Malia, his expression softening instantly. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go get you a new phone." And with that, he wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders and led her away. The park, once filled with the easy sounds of laughter and rustling leaves, had fallen into an unnatural silence. The moment had stretched, crystallized into something weighty, something that settled into the bones of everyone present, People who had merely been bystanders minutes ago were now witnesses, their phones held steady as they recorded, their eyes shifting between the two men standing in the center of it all. Barack Obama remained still, his gaze locked onto Officer Blake with a quiet intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. There was no raised voice, no outward sign of rage, only an unshakable, unyielding presence. A kind of power that needed no force to be felt. Blake, on the other hand, stood rigid, his posture betraying the battle raging inside him. His jaw tightened, then loosened. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling as if grasping for an authority that had just been stripped away. He had built his career on the certainty that he was the one in control, the one who dictated the rules of engagement. And yet, here he stood, exposed. Captain Rodriguez, the highest-ranking officer on the scene, stepped forward with measured purpose. He was a man who had seen enough in his years to recognize when a situation had already been decided before words were even spoken. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. Neither was the fact that there was no way to bury what had happened here. The cameras were rolling. The damage was done. "Officer Blake," Rodriguez said, his voice even, official, "turn over your badge and weapon. Effective immediately." Blake's entire body stiffened, as though his own spine were resisting the command. His mouth opened, a protest forming before he even knew what to say. He glanced around the park, searching for some form of validation, some unspoken support, but all he found were faces watching him with expectation, some cold, some neutral, but none on his side. His lips parted again, a struggle playing across his features. "Captain, I was doing my job." Rodriguez barely reacted. "You've done enough." The words were final. Blake's breath left him in a sharp exhale, as if all the fight had been knocked out of him at once. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in the grim realization that there was no way out of this. He reached for his belt, unclasping the polished badge that had once been a symbol of his authority, his superiority, his ability to control the narrative. Now it was nothing more than an emblem of his own downfall. He held it for a moment too long before finally extending it toward Rodriguez, his fingers reluctant to let go. When he did, it felt as though something inside him cracked. Then, with an expression caught between defiance and resignation, he unholstered his weapon, the cold steel feeling foreign in his hands for the first time in years. Slowly, he placed it in Rodriguez's waiting grip. It was done. The shift in the air was almost tangible. There was no applause, no verbal outcry from the onlookers. Only a sense of gravity, a quiet understanding that they had just witnessed the unraveling of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Rodriguez stepped back, his expression unreadable. He knew what came next, an internal review, the possibility of legal action, the department scrambling to mitigate the inevitable storm of media attention. But that wasn't his concern right now. His concern was maintaining control over a situation that had already spiraled far beyond what any of them had expected. Obama, who had remained silent through it all, finally moved. He shifted slightly, his hand still resting on Malia's shoulder in a steady, grounding presence. When he spoke, his voice carried no malice, no unnecessary force, just a simple, pointed observation. "You thought you could intimidate a child." Blake flinched, barely perceptibly, but enough. Obama's gaze held steady, unwavering. "You thought you could get away with it." The officer didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. A flicker of something passed through Blake's eyes. Anger, resentment, or maybe just the crushing realization that, for once, he wasn't the one holding all the power. He turned sharply, his boots crunching against the gravel as he made his way toward his cruiser, his every movement stiff with the effort of containing whatever storm was raging inside him. No one stopped him. No one needed to. As the disgraced officer pulled open his car door and slid inside, the weight of the moment settled fully onto his shoulders. He gripped the steering wheel with knuckles gone white, staring ahead but seeing nothing. The career he had spent years building had just been dismantled in the span of minutes, and the world was watching. With the roar of an engine, the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a scene that would not be forgotten. The silence held for another long moment before the energy in the park slowly shifted. The bystanders who had once stood frozen in place began to stir, murmuring to one another, their phones still raised, recording the last moments of a reckoning. Obama, however, had already turned his attention back to his daughter. The anger that had simmered just beneath his composed exterior was fading now, replaced by something softer, a father's concern. Malia, still standing beside him, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She wasn't trembling, wasn't crying, but there was something fragile in the way she exhaled, something tight in her posture that told him just how much she had been holding in. He gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Let's go," he said, his voice quiet now, meant just for her. She nodded, and together they turned towards the black SUV waiting at the curb. Secret Service agents fell into formation around them, but none of them spoke. There was nothing left to be said. As they reached the vehicle, Malia hesitated. She glanced back just once. The park, once a place of quiet normalcy, now felt different. The people who had stood by, who had watched it all unfold, would go back to their lives. Some might forget by tomorrow. Some would post their videos online dissecting every detail. But for her, this moment would linger. She had always known, in the abstract, that the world was unfair. But now she had seen it, felt it, and she had watched it be set right. With a final breath, she climbed into the SUV, her father sliding in beside her. The door shut with a quiet finality. The convoy pulled away, leaving behind a park that would never be quite the same again. The convoy moved through the city streets with quiet precision, the rhythmic hum of the engines filling the otherwise silent interior of the SUV. Malia sat beside her father, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blurred scenery outside the tinted window. The towering buildings, the bustling sidewalks, the neon-lit signs of coffee shops and boutiques, they all passed in a haze, background noise to the storm of emotions still simmering beneath her calm exterior. Barack Obama sat beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. He hadn't said much since they had left the park, allowing the weight of the morning's events to settle. He knew his daughter well enough to understand that she needed a moment to process, to breathe. So he gave her space, but his presence alone was a reassurance. After a long stretch of silence, Malia finally exhaled. "That was," she started, but the words faltered before she could finish. Obama turned his head slightly, watching her. "Yeah," he said simply, filling in the space where words failed. She let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "I knew things like that happened," she admitted. "I just never thought it would happen to me." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's how it always feels," he said, "until it happens." She looked down at her hands, running a thumb absent-mindedly over her fingers. There was a tightness in her chest that she couldn't quite describe, a weight that hadn't fully lifted even though the immediate threat was gone. "Do you think he'll get his job back?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Obama exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening just slightly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know this. What happened today is not something that can be ignored. People saw, people recorded, and that means accountability." Malia nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully believed it. She had seen too many stories where things like this ended with little more than a slap on the wrist, but still, there had been something different about today. The weight of her father's presence, the way the world seemed to pause when he stepped out of that SUV, it had mattered. She turned her gaze back to the window, her thoughts shifting. The phone. The shattered remains of it, lying forgotten on the pavement. It wasn't about the device itself. She knew she could get a new one, maybe even a better one. But it was the principle. The way it had been taken from her, the way it had been broken, as if her belongings, her very existence meant nothing. As if she meant nothing. Obama must have read her thoughts because he suddenly straightened and spoke. "Let's go get you a new phone." Malia blinked, glancing at him. "Now?" He gave her a small smile. "No point in waiting." She hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "Okay." The SUV smoothly changed lanes, heading towards the shopping district. The phone store was bright and modern, its walls lined with sleek devices displayed under soft lighting. The moment they walked in, the employees, already whispering amongst themselves, immediately straightened, their professional smiles widening with the recognition of who had just stepped through the doors. A young man in a neatly pressed shirt stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mr. President," he said, his voice carefully measured, though his excitement was barely contained. "It's an honor. How can we help you today?" Obama returned the greeting with a polite nod. "We're here for my daughter," he said, placing a hand lightly on Malia's shoulder. "She needs a new phone." The employee nodded enthusiastically, gesturing toward the display cases. "Of course. We have all the latest models. Anything in particular you're looking for?" Malia glanced up at her father, and for the first time since the incident in the park, her lips twitched into something resembling amusement. "You're not going to spend an hour debating specs again, are you?" Obama chuckled. "No promises." As they moved toward the displays, something in the air shifted. The tension that had clung to Malia since the park began to dissipate, replaced by something lighter. It wasn't just about getting a new phone, it was about reclaiming what had been taken, in the smallest but most significant way. She picked up a device, turning it over in her hands. It was almost identical to the one she had lost. Obama watched her, his expression softening. "That one good?" Malia nodded. "Yeah." The employee beamed. "Great choice. I'll get it set up for you." As they waited, Malia leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. The day had started with a simple moment of peace. A quiet morning in the park, her only concern being how to pass the time until her father arrived. She had never imagined it would end like this. She turned toward him. "Do you ever get used to it?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. "Used to what?" She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything. The scrutiny, the weight of expectations, the way people's reactions shifted the moment they recognized who he was. All of this. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. "You don't get used to it," he admitted, "but you learn how to carry it." She considered that. The employee returned with the new phone, freshly set up. All ready to go. Obama pulled out his wallet, but before he could say a word, the manager, who had now joined them at the counter, quickly intervened. "No charge, Mr. President. Consider it a gift." Obama hesitated, then smiled knowingly. "Appreciate it," he said, accepting the device. He turned to Malia, handing it to her. "Here you go." She took it, running her fingers over the smooth glass. It was just a phone, a piece of technology that could be replaced 100 times over. And yet, as she held it, she felt something settle inside her, a sense of resolution, of control. She looked up at her father. "Thanks, Dad." His eyes softened, his voice warm. "Always." They left the store together, stepping back into the world outside, the city bustling around them. And as they walked, side by side, Malia knew, without a doubt, that no matter what came next, no matter what challenges the world threw her way, she would never face them alone. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. See you in the next one.